All right, Friday afternoon at Breakpoint. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Greg Exathalis. I'm the general counsel at Multicoin Capital, where I lead our policy functions. And I also teach fintech and blockchain law and policy at Duke University School of Law. And I've got two pros here with us, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves. Marina, you first.
Thank you. My name is Marina, and I'm a co-founder and a director of the European Crypto Initiative, which is an advocacy group based in Brussels. And for the last 3 years, we have been talking to regulators, specifically on MiCA, but on all the other regulations as well, and we will talk about it in the panel.
My name is Miller Whitehouse Levine. My organization is called the DeFi Education Fund. We similarly do education and advocacy to policymakers focused on DeFi in the United States at both the state and federal level.
So we've got two of the people who are doing this on a full-time basis at a very high level on both sides of the Atlantic. Obviously, the world's a big place, and there are other jurisdictions, but our expertise lies where it lies. So I'm curious if you guys can walk us through what it actually means in your context, in your job as pros and leading trade groups or interest groups in attacking these issues, educating policymakers, legislators, and how I'm curious how it is distinct in the EU and the US. And Marina, or actually Miller, why don't you lead us first through the US?
Yeah, in the US it's complicated, but you'll see it's even more complicated out here. It really breaks down in the US by branch of government. So when you're talking to Congress as a developer or DeFi advocate, you're really trying to educate them about why the technology matters, why they should care about this, why it solves problems that they care about addressing on behalf of their constituents, and really fitting it into their key areas of focus, because you have to relate these things to something people care about, because DeFi is complicated, crypto is complicated. If you don't contextualize it, you lose people. So I think about Congress and the legislature generally as being an exercise in convincing and education. And ultimately, when it comes to lawmaking, Congress is the final boss in the US. That is different from the approach that I think we now have to take with the executive branch and the regulators. As folks probably know in this room, it's been a pretty hostile environment from the regulatory agencies, especially over the last couple of years. And that means it's a different relationship on several levels. The first is that it's way more detail-oriented. The implementing agencies and regulations are about the nitty-gritty detail of compliance with laws that have been passed by Congress. So kind of the depth of expertise needed is different. The other thing I'll say is that it's a much more combative relationship at this point. There are many rulemakings that are pending in the United States that, if implemented in the form proposed, would effectively prohibit the development of DeFi in the United States. And so naturally, when you kind of reach the final boss point on the regulatory front, you're in a combative stance. And I don't mean that like, throwing insults or anything like that. It's like the legal arguments that we're going to win on, and you're making them as opposed to trying to convince people that your policy positions are correct. So then finally, the judiciary, for the most part, if you end up there, something's gone wrong. So hopefully no one's going to have to engage in the judiciary unless it's on a proactive basis. But yeah, overall, you got Congress, the regulators. Congress is about convincing and education, and to the extent that folks are getting involved, we'll talk a bit more about how to do that in a good way.
Yeah. Marina, how's it different on this side of the Atlantic?
I think it's pretty different when I compare the US advocacy versus the EU. Feels like in the US, it feels more like an action movie. So there's a lot of things happening. You see that Twitter is very engaged. There's like a lot of discussions. And in Europe, it's more like a European artistic movie, which is like a little bit calmer, but like more predictable maybe.
It's in black and white?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah.
So what happens in the EU is that at the beginning of the mandate, the European Commission, after their first 100 days of discussing, they have a plan on what they're going to do in the next 5 years. And in this case, we know more or less what's going to happen in the next 5 years. What happened 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago, was that the European Union wanted to regulate digital finance. That was a whole package. And a part of it was also MiCA, the Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation. And that's the one that regulates crypto assets. You mostly heard about this, but there's other things. For example, the anti-money laundering package, where we had 4 different documents and also discussed in the last 4 years. So what we do as an organization is we need to know what's happening, so we need to know what the plan is. But at the same time, I think we're spending a lot of efforts and time understanding when something is happening, and we need a precise time, because this is when the regulators usually talk to us. They need to talk to us the exact week when they discuss this specific topic. And they want to hear from us a feedback on, for example, how to regulate or not to regulate self-custodial wallets, but they want to hear it at that specific week when they have that meeting. So timing is very important for us. But at the same time, going back to what I said, it's a little bit more predictable, is because when Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation was first written, we know that more or less around 60% of what we saw there, it's going to be also implemented in the final regulation, which is pretty nice. But in between, we're talking to a lot of institutions. We talk to the European Commission, we talk to the Parliament, we talk to the Council, which is composed of many different member states, basically all the member states. So we do somehow talk to the member states at the same time also in the institutions on the EU level. So it's pretty complex. Sometimes it's also good that you have a person from a specific country in a team that speaks to that MP from that country. So the cultural aspect is also pretty important here.
Now, when we were preparing for this and talking, you noted an interesting component. And in the US, we have this famous cartoon from the 70s where how a bill becomes a law, and it's like a little anthropomorphic piece of legislation sitting on the steps of Capitol Hill. In the US, law starts with politicians. It starts with the congressional offices that Miller's in, talking to the staffers who are drafting. In the EU, it's a little different, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in the EU, it starts with the European Commission, and the people that are writing laws in the European Commission, they're very knowledgeable, they're very technical, they really do understand the topic, they do understand finance in this case. For example, when it comes to MiCA. And then the second part is when the Parliament discusses the framework, and they do write their own version. And then the Council comes in and they write their own version. So at the end, we have a process which is called the trialogue, where all 3 versions come together, and then a combination of those, it's basically a final draft that we see at the end being published in the official journal in the European Union.
So how much education do you do as part of your regular job in advocating for the industry versus more strategic advocacy and policy goals? I mean, Miller has to do a lot of education, sometimes of us on fighting the good fight, and sometimes of those we're trying to convince. It's right in the name, DeFi Education Fund. How much of the educating do you need to do, or how much of it is strict policy strategy?
So I think it's a mix, and it really depends on the institution. Again, for example, if we compare the European Commission versus a parliament, we would need to do much more education on the parliament side than the European Commission side. And then also the complexity of the documents that, for example, we are sharing with them would be very different. Sometimes they do not have much time, especially in the parliament, so we need to keep it short, straight to the point. And in some other organizations might be longer. For example, one very interesting thing is that right now MiCA is in the secondary process, which we call a technical process, where the European Banking Authority, the European Securities Market Agency comes in, and they would like to hear much more, I would say, concise documents, like longer legal reasoning behind our arguments. And this is also, in a way, a challenge from our organization. We need to know exactly what kind of documents and how to deliver to the specific organizations and institutions.
So Miller, in the audience and at this conference all week, we've got founders, we've got engineers, we've got builders, we've got investors, we've got just general enthusiasts who love crypto, love the Solana ecosystem, and want to advocate for the industry as a whole. How should someone sitting in the audience look at you and what you do in your job and how they can get involved?
Got it. Yeah, I think one of the main takeaways people should take from this talk is that you can make a difference, and I think it's an intimidating. It's intimidating to start the process of engaging with our political system, especially because generally folks view it as being hostile to what we're working on. That is definitely true with the regulators, but Congress is like hermetically sealed from the executive agencies. And so the number one thing I recommend folks doing, and Greg, I'm going to ask you to talk about political engagement, which I think you're the best at, one of the best at in industry, but directly engaging with your local representatives actually can make a massive, massive difference. And Marina, folks like Marina, myself, Greg, are here to help folks do that. I think the number one thing that individuals can do other than political engagement, which Greg will get to here shortly, is to literally just email their local representatives and one of their senators and talk about what you're doing, why it matters to you, why you think it's going to make the world a better place. And generally you can get meetings, and we will literally help you write the emails if that would be useful, because to the extent we can have crypto developers in every congressional district who have a relationship with their local rep, that would be a complete game changer. So that would be my top recommendation. Think about it as being like an hour a month of an investment that can really make a difference. And not to take over the moderating role here, but Greg, you should talk about political engagement. Yeah.
No, and I kind of break down advocacy into three categories, which is direct advocacy, why you should care, education, what are you caring about, and then direct political advocacy, which is, particularly in the US, politicians are always running for office. They need to raise funds, and you can be very strategic in how you do that and create an environment, gather people at fundraisers, have direct access to talk about those very same things, why it matters. And I think that we've seen a combination of constituent outreach as well as political giving, particularly since the infrastructure bill in the US in 2021, that has really ramped up and made politicians as well as their staffers realize that this industry is important and it can be a source of new political growth. And I don't think that has universally taken off in DC, but it has taken off with a number of important key reps who have made this a core part of their platform. So political engagement, you don't need to be raising hundreds of thousands of dollars to participate in the political process. It's more getting involved and being thoughtful about to whom you're contributing, and also having the opportunity to ask them, if you're talking to an advocate of the industry on the Hill, who else among your colleagues do you want us to engage with to help you in the work you're doing in trying to get support for a bill or trying to rally support against a bill? But
that's right. Yeah, we have allies, and you can ask them, what should we be doing? And they will tell you. So Greg's absolutely right.
Yeah. Marina, in the EU, again, the process is a little different. Can you talk about, so first the EU, much like the US, has multiple states that roll up to a federal government that doesn't control everything. The EU is not necessarily identical to that, but it perhaps rhymes a little since 92. Can you talk a little about how individuals can engage either through ECI or through other groups or advocates with Parliament or the Commission?
Yes, definitely. So I would first say that if we want to, in a way, talk to regulators, first we need to be seen somehow, make them feel that there is an industry, there are jobs created in this industry, and that the regulation is going to affect those things. So they definitely think and care about job creation in Europe, especially when it comes to innovation and when it comes to tech regulation. The first thing I would say, go to your local organizations. In every member state, there is a local organization that is speaking to local regulators. They will be very important going forward, again, especially because of MiCA. The national competent authorities are going to be the one giving licenses and overseeing MiCA's implementation, and that's very, very important. We know that there is a big difference between all the national competent authorities all over Europe, and ideally what we would like to see is that they all have the, in a way, insight into how this industry works to make them, to help them make, in a way, optimal decisions. At the end of the day, all the major decisions, at least in some instances when it comes to finance, when it comes to AML, etc., they are made in Brussels, and we need to talk to people in Brussels. In the parliament, again, the parliament is composed of MPs that come from different member states. And whenever you talk to somebody that is elected in the Netherlands and sits in Brussels, they will definitely listen to you much more likely than you talking to someone that is not from the Netherlands if you live here. So I think this is a pretty interesting edge, and we can have very nice conversations doing that.
So another area which I know is always sort of an overwhelming concern, when I've been in crypto for a while, in the early days, the people that were being engaged with by the industry were the regulators. And there was always some apprehension or fear on putting your company or yourself out in front of a regulator by putting yourself on the map. Miller, can you talk a little bit about the different ways that someone in the audience can engage, whether through direct process, through a trade association or an industry group, or even through a law firm, to engage in, well, for example, right now we have the Treasury Department and its proposed broker rule, and we have how many comment letters that have been
50,000. Keep them coming.
And the prior record for a Treasury rule was something like 3,000?
Yes, very few.
Yeah, but in general, like, where are the places people should be directly advocating?
Yep.
And where and why should they be going through a trade organization or an industry group like DeFi Education or ECI?
Elected representatives, get in there, make sure they know your name, and directly engage with your representatives. I do not recommend directly engaging with any of the regulatory agencies, because I think the fear that Greg described is quite well placed. You go in to have a good faith conversation, and then 2 months later, you get a subpoena. So don't recommend doing that. If you need to do something with the agencies other than submitting comment letters, which are not, I don't think, going to put you under the gun, go through trade associations. If you're not a member, you can still ask them. We can help too. And law firms can also be helpful, although they will probably recommend you don't speak to the regulatory agencies. But beyond comment letters, I would just be skeptical of directly engaging with the regulators. And again, that is a totally different story with elected representatives, which are generally safe.
And Marina, in the EU?
So I can give two examples that were very interesting. The last few months, the French regulators, the ACPR and the AMF, they issued a position paper on DeFi. And if you're working in DeFi, you had a brilliant opportunity to respond to those. They do read them, they really care. They even organized an online meeting for everyone to be involved in the process. And I think that there's a lot of similar opportunities in the EU to respond to. And I would really, if you have time, of course, I know you are interested in these topics, but I would really like to propose something similar, or again, reach out to us. We're writing responses to those position papers, and we would like to hear your opinion as well and include it in those position papers.
And it worked with ACPR, right?
It did.
In 5 seconds or less, the most important issue that people in the audience should worry about. Miller first.
Treasury broker rulemaking in the US.
5.1 seconds. Marina.
Regulation of stable coins, asset reference tokens specifically, and significant e-money tokens.
And with that, I remind you all that we are going to make it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.